Before we get into the meat of this debate, before we start, I'd like to explain a little bit about the format of the debate so you're all aware of what's going to happen. We will have two speakers from both sides speak one at a time. First, we're going to have the government come speak, then we'll have a member of the opposition come speak. They'll both sit down, and then we will have a 7-minute Q&A. During that 7-minute Q&A, you, the audience, and the judges will have the opportunity to question the debaters. They can be confronting, they can be challenging questions, or they can be softball. Just trying to see where the debaters stand on certain issues, get some insight into their thought. After that, we're going to repeat that again. Another speaker from the government, another speaker from the opposition, so on, so forth, another 7-minute Q&A. After that, we will have a 3-minute rebuttal, when the debaters on both sides will send a representative to attack the big picture ideas from the other side. Then we will have another 7-minute grand Q&A, grand question time, where you can ask any question to any debater who has spoken so far. After that, we're going to do a little something we call the poll. That poll will decide who's going to play a big role in tonight. We're going to start off with a poll, we're going to end with a poll, and you, the audience, are going to have a big say in who wins. So let's do that right now, actually. Raise your hand if you believe that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was, in fact, not justified. We should not have withdrawn. Raise your hand if you believe that. You got that? All right. Now raise your hand if you believe that the withdrawal in Afghanistan was, in fact, justified. You think it was the right thing to do. It's a lot more. You know that? Yep. And now raise your hand if you're just not sure. You're on the fence, you can be swayed.
Can we just abstain?
Absolutely, yeah. Count this as abstain as well if you're not feel comfortable voting. All right. Now, here's where this poll comes this way. We're going to do another poll after the debate, after the rebuttals have been done. You, the audience, if whoever polls you more in their direction, whether it be the opposition or the government, will give the audience, will give the debaters 3 extra points. 3 extra points. The judges, all their ballots will have 2 votes as well, and so you guys have a very important role in deciding who's going to win today's debate. And winning the debate is always important, but with over $300 in prizes on the line, it's more important than ever. I think we can agree. So without further ado, let's get started. The debate will now begin. All right. Dave?
Good evening, everyone. I would like to thank the Missouri Debate Union for allowing me the honor of debating a topic that is close to my heart, as well as thank faculty, staff, friends, and my fellow Mizzou students who made the decision to come to Jesse Hall instead of getting to the dinner lines early. My goal for the next 7 minutes is to provide you all with an understanding of the historical background that contributed to the situation you currently face, that being the collapse of the government in Afghanistan and the United States' role in that, and why the withdrawal was in fact unjustified. I will also focus more specifically on the historical and current crisis of Afghan women. We cannot, as American citizens, neglect our moral duty to these people. When looking at the roots of the Taliban's rise to power, it is important to consider the situation of Afghanistan spanning the 20th century. In line with the USSR's expansionist policy, the Soviets invaded Kabul and appointed Babrak Karmal in 1979 as president of the newly established communist government in Afghanistan. According to Amnesty International, though Afghanistan had always had practices considered by most as sexist and discriminating, women had enjoyed some freedom through the Soviet occupation, attending universities and holding important job positions alongside men. However, many Afghans believed they had a holy mission to end communism, as the Soviets had disrupted many cultural practices and sought to promote their own agenda. These Afghans formed militias known as the Mujahideen. Though generally simple-minded people employed as farmers, these guerrilla fighters were able to defeat the communists, especially, might I note, after the United States began to assist the Mujahideen, which proves that the United States has failed in establishing a self-sustaining democracy yet again. With the Soviets gone, though, these men no longer had a common enemy and turned on each other. This led to factions controlling different parts of Afghanistan and making life disastrous for civilians. In this chaos emerged the Taliban, eventually establishing a theocratic regime in '96. With this authority came radical changes. They took a direct stance on the role of women, that being no role other than to stay at home. The Western dress that had become popular with Soviet occupation was quickly outlawed and replaced with the mandatory donning of the burqa. Might I add again, this burqa is not by any means the true cultural symbol of dress of the Afghan people. This was something placed by the Taliban. They controlled every minute detail of a women's lives. Any steps forward that had been achieved under the progressive Soviets went 2 or more steps backward. And with the withdrawal of US troops this year, we will see a textbook example of the phrase, history repeats itself. Taliban student, and ironically enough they are students of the American strategy. How could we have left gyms, drones, and incredibly advanced weapons behind? The Taliban have already been watching and waiting for 2 decades, and now we give them the ingredients, even going as far as measuring them out for them to use. This is unacceptable. The issue of gender inequality, moreover, is a global one. No nation can claim advancement when their female population is not given equal opportunities, and the US can certainly not claim success if the genocide of women as a presence in Afghanistan continues. When the Taliban was in power, from 1996 to 2001, women became a main target of the totalitarian regime. Armed with a twisted interpretation of religious texts, the Taliban sought to control the lives of women under their rule. Conversely, the Taliban seemed to be leaning towards lessening their oppression, and in 2019, quote, committed to guaranteeing women their rights under Islam, and in a way that neither their legitimate rights are violated nor their human dignity and Afghan values are threatened. The question is, what kind of definition were they using for Islam and Afghan values? The correct meanings are certainly not reflected in their policies and actions. Furthermore, women in the 1950s experienced many freedoms. This was pre-Soviet occupation. They held positions in government, education, and medical sectors. In some areas of Afghanistan, up to 40% of jobs were held by women. But with the Taliban came severities in every aspect of their lives. The Taliban banned all girls' education other than madrasas. Their meaning for this word is religious schools. However, in Arabic, madrasa means school. They have placed the religious significance on that and, again, twisted it to their own interpretation, of which these schools only a few girls were able to attend. This reveals a severe loss of future female intelligentsia after the fall of the Taliban, and we will continue to see this in this generation. Let us consider this statement by the Voice of Jihad, a website run by the Taliban, where they called the fight for women's education the debauchery of women. In the words of Malala Yousafzai, with guns you can kill terrorists, with education you can kill terrorism. Proper education of both men and women should have been our priority while we were in Afghanistan. Afghan women's right defender Akila Norozi said, "Let us have courage and determination till all the rights are achieved." Let's kind of dive into some of these rights that have been so fought for. According to Amnesty International, forced virginity testing on women has increased since the Taliban. These tests give little indication and are invasive, humiliating, and potentially dangerous. This is just one example of these grave human rights violations. In addition, women have an extremely challenging time winning a case in court. This may shock you, but under Taliban law, 1 man in court was equal to 2 female witnesses. I have sources that discuss several stories of women who were put in prison for, quote, adultery, though in reality they were forced by their husbands into prostitution. But because there was no woman present, enough women to properly advocate for their case, they were put in jail for the crimes of their husbands. Another thing to note is the women that continue to be assassinated for acts the Taliban declare immoral. Take Shushmita Banerjee, an Indian woman who married an Afghan man. She was killed by the Taliban for her autobiography detailing her experiences, her advocacy, and for not wearing a burqa. The Taliban's outlawing of television, phones, and internet, moreover, as a case study by Human Rights Watch details, proves that without access to vital resources that technology has made available to much of the world, take us, for example, look at all of the technological advancements that we have to further our debate today. Without these simple things that we take for granted, Afghans are yet again left trailing behind the rest of the world who have much better financial and educational opportunities. Finally, I'd like to share an interesting parallel that I think is crucial in understanding this political stance. Capital. One with an A, one with an O. The difference is how we reacted. In the Capitol riots, we were able to suppress the violence and ensure the democratic values we as Americans stand for were not taken from us. In the capital of Kabul, however, we stood by and watched as the Taliban took over everything we have worked towards. In conclusion, not for a lack of effort to lose Afghanistan, but for a lack of organization and patience. The withdrawal was too soon, it was too messy, it was too expensive. the withdrawal was indeed unjustified. We implore the audience to contemplate the facts and decide for yourselves which stance is the moral one. Thank you.
Alright, hope you guys don't mind taking my mask off because class is getting funky. Is this chamber in order? Afternoon, everybody. My name is Isaac Yontz. Today, my partner Ben and I are honored to represent the opposition. We proudly hold that the military withdrawal from Afghanistan was justified, and this is clear for three key reasons. First, the never-ending war in Afghanistan caused an enormous loss of civilian life and exacerbated terrorism. Second, the war increased the global power of China. And third, the war was a failure of a backwards attempt at nation building that made Afghanistan unstable. For the last 20 years, America has ignored the lesson history teaches us. To permanently stop the Taliban and prevent terrorism, you have to treat the disease, not the symptoms. Ladies and gentlemen of the audience and members of the House, throughout today's debate, keep one question in the back of your minds. Would it be just to continue the war in Afghanistan? First, the war in Afghanistan was a failure. Military intervention did not work. All of our hard power efforts, our guns, our boots, our drones, only exacerbated the problems that plagued Afghanistan. The war cost the lives of 3,000 American troops and caused over hundreds of thousands of veterans to suffer from severe disabilities. Reckless conflict caused the death of 50,000 Afghan civilians. This atrocious loss of life hurt America's legitimacy, caused the Taliban to gain popular support, and most importantly, it bred terrorism, a fact that the CIA themselves acknowledged in leaked documents. But worst of all, this never-ending war resulted in the loss of life of 50,000 Afghan civilians. 50,000 families were robbed of their loved ones. Ben and I believe that the widespread death of innocent people is not justice. Continuing a never-ending war in Afghanistan was not justice. And allowing China to grow its power is not justice. The United States withdrawal of Afghanistan saved Afghan civilian lives and American lives. The cost of war justified withdrawal. Second, the American political effort failed. Nation building was doomed from the start. The United States military tried to set up a government from the national level first and ignored the local governments and the people of Afghanistan. In fact, in 2013, the Afghan government utilized village stability operations and established local police forces that decreased the Taliban's operational power. If police authority is localized, then it is more likely to handle circumstances unique to that region. In any successful government, the foundation is the people. However, America tried to build a government backwards, starting with a strong, centralized national government. Think of this as trying to construct a house, but instead of starting with the foundation, you begin by building the roof. That doesn't make any sense. When the United States created a security force in Afghanistan, they drained local police forces to create one national police force. They created FBI agents, paramilitants, and a security force that was a massive failure. This deployment of American troops kept the Afghan government dependent on America. These conditions, caused by American deployments, held virtually no executive power, no military power, and no national police authority that could enforce these laws. The dependency and instability created by American deployments kept Afghanistan in a state of disaster, a state of wartime that destroyed the lives of Afghan civilians. Afghanistan's disease was independence, and as long as the United States prolonged independence, we were only curing the symptoms. According to the Watson Institute at Brown University, the war exacerbated the effects of poverty, malnutrition, poor sanitation, lack of access to healthcare, environmental degradations, exacerbated violence towards women, and harmed women's rights of the Afghan civilian population as a whole. An Afghanistan at war was an Afghanistan where the people suffered. Each day, America continued to stay in Afghanistan, more innocent people suffered, and more civilians died. Each day, America occupied Afghanistan. America treated the symptom, not the disease. Remaining in Afghanistan would have continued the instability and the never-ending warfighting, which every day costs the lives of Americans and innocent Afghan people who were simply trying to live their lives. How could it be just to continue this war? Finally, occupying Afghanistan emboldened China. Ask yourselves, who wanted this war to continue? Russia wanted this war to continue. China wanted this war to continue. Because this war distracted America from growing threats elsewhere. The war kept America from aiding its allies elsewhere. Second, America's involvement in the war helped China economically. And as America fought an unwinnable war, China gained power in the South China Sea and furthered their Belt and Road Initiative. While the United States prolonged the Afghan war efforts, China rose to prominence and took advantage and exacerbated the humanitarian crisis of Uyghur Muslims. For 20 years, the war in Afghanistan cost the lives of more than 50,000 Afghan civilians. The conflict killed thousands of American soldiers and caused disabilities for hundreds of thousands more. And today, when we are faced with the question of was it just to leave, ask yourself once again, was continuing the war just? Ben and I are honored to represent the side that believes that this war should have ended. Thank you.
All right, with that speech, we are now beginning question time. If you have questions, feel free to raise your hand. We'll call on you. So, if you have questions, please raise your hand, and wait for me to recognize you. But I will exercise my ability as chair and ask the first question. Jaden, this question goes to you. You talk about all the trouble, all the heinous acts are being committed against humankind right now in Afghanistan. But at the same note, the U.S. was unable to build a solid, reliable state in Afghanistan. Why and how are we able to create a new social order in Afghanistan that treats women with the dignity they deserve?
Thank you for your question. I would like to reiterate the fact that my speech was more directed to the historical aspect, so if you would like a more detailed explanation of that specific question, my partner Kyla will be happy to answer it, but I am also happy to answer that question. As I mentioned, the U.S. should not have stayed in Afghanistan that long and not achieved what they really should have. At the same time, we cannot simply leave the way that we did and leave them to fend for themselves. We are of the position that the United States should have left in a more timely manner. And as Kyler will mention, there are specific steps that can be taken to properly establish a democratic state, unlike the United States' history with failing states around the world. Take Vietnam, take Kosovo. And so our goal here today is not simply to convince you whether or not it was justified, but to convince you to take action to help the Afghan civilians now with the resources that you have.
Billy, one more just had a question.
Yes, for Jaden as well. You have very altruistic goals with your intent of kind of a delayed departure. Of course, I recognize that you also said that we should have stayed so long. With that, I agree, but with the realities of leaving, is it really realistic to expect that had we taken longer to leave, we would have been able to do anything meaningful? Since realistically, we haven't in the past during our occupation of Afghanistan.
I think it's important to note, like you said, that we were there for too long. That is correct. But we also left too soon. And it is not realistic to assume that that region of the world will stay in any way, shape, or form how we would like it to be. It is unacceptable that the United States left all of their technology there. That was not on accident. That is all I will say about that because we were on camera. But let's think about the fact that as soon as the U.S. left, the Afghan president fled to my birthplace. And the fact that we were unable to establish any form of democracy that was lasting. And so the fact that we could not even say that for ourselves and for our democratic viewpoints and the ideologies that we stand for, that is horrific. And I'm of the opinion that we should have gone in a more organized fashion to ensure that before we leave, we have key people on the ground in the government who will ensure that it would stay working in some way that we would like it to be. However, pulling out every member of our service is simply irrational.
How do you recommend?
I actually also have a question for Jaden. One of the arguments that you mentioned was a quote that said that education kills terrorism, and you said that we should have focused on education. Did America not attempt to provide more educational resources, and did that work at all?
Yes, it did. We were unable to provide visuals at this time, but with me I do have a graph. And it details the gross enrollment of both female and male students in primary and secondary schools, pre-Soviet, pre-Taliban, continuing into Taliban, and then after the U.S. takeover. And we can see that the numbers skyrocket in 2001 when the U.S. took over. So yes, we were doing much to help educate, but it was not enough. And the fact that we left in this fashion is just educating that generation that the United States is not reliable. And so now that the Taliban is back into control, women are no longer allowed to enroll in schools or be involved in the workplace. And so let us not have everything that we did do for education go to waste.
Isaac, I have a question for you actually. In your speech, you talk about a lot about the failure of the U.S. state to build a reliable Afghanistan state, the failure of creating a solid security apparatus, the failure to create a basic Afghanistan state and several other aspects. With that in mind, can't we say that we got them into that mess? We created a failed state. Does that not mean we have an obligation to get them out of the hole we dug them in?
I think all of us can agree that we had an obligation to get them out of that hole. However, our hard power efforts, okay? Our drones, our guns, and our boots were not the way to do it. The CIA recently published this document on coin strategy, and my partner Ben will bring this up in his speech. But basically, from 2010 to 2013, the United States Department of Defense decreased funding to Afghanistan, okay? And during that time, the Taliban's freedom of operation actually decreased. So what we see is when we decrease the amount of money that we send to Afghanistan, we actually solve the problem itself. Sometimes the problem will just solve naturally. And furthermore, to an actual legitimate way to solve the problems that we have in Afghanistan, I would say we do one of two things, or maybe both things. First, we start out at the local level, okay? We have to create these police forces that are localized, that are able to deal with the problems that are related to the certain circumstances of the region. And second, we don't take over and attempt to democratize a nation that doesn't want to democratize from the top down. And from that, I would like to ask a question to Jaden. So, as I said in my answer to that question, I think we can both agree that the way that we withdrew was wrong. But that's not what the resolution is asking. So my question to you is, was America's top-down approach effective at weeding out the Taliban?
No, as we can clearly see for ourselves, the Taliban was able to take over the almost entirety of the country months, not even months, weeks after we left.
This will be our final question of the hour. We're going to go way in the back. User with the glasses.
Yes. So my question is for Isaac. In your argument, you presented the idea that we distracted our efforts from China and created a humanitarian crisis with the Uyghur Muslims. Does the withdrawal of Afghanistan, however, not create another humanitarian crisis, as Jaden has pointed out, with women in Afghanistan? Is it better to pull out and create this new humanitarian crisis instead of trying to prevent yet another one?
Right. So that's a very good question. And to your question, I would address it and then ask a question back. So for the past 20 years that the United States was in Afghanistan, did they solve any humanitarian crisis? And the simple answer is no. Obviously not. If the United States chose to occupy Afghanistan for 2 decades and didn't get anything done, they weren't able to establish any sort of governments or weed out the Taliban at all, what humanitarian crisis would we be solving if we continue to stay in there? And second, I would address this idea that since the United States is fighting the Taliban at the southern Chinese border, that's just another problem that China doesn't have to worry about, okay? The Taliban doesn't have to worry, China doesn't have to worry about the Taliban invading into China's southern border, and it just gives them another reason to take another step ahead of us.
And with that question, time has elapsed. If you still have a burning question on your mind, do not worry. You'll get the opportunity to address both of these debaters towards the end of the debate. With that in mind, we are now looking for the second speaker on the government side. Tyler, would you please step to the podium?
If we're all in order, I'll begin. I raise my voice not so I can shout, but so that those without a voice can be heard. Malala Yousafzai. I would like to begin my speech by thanking everyone for attending and for allowing my partner and I to speak on behalf of the people of Afghanistan at such a critical point in Afghan history, and at a time in which their illegitimate government will not allow them to do so for themselves. You heard Jaden speak extensively regarding the atrocities committed against the Afghan women following the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan on August 30th, 2021. This was after a 20-year occupation. I will be speaking to you further on the systematic human rights violations committed against the citizens of Afghanistan by the Taliban. Violations such as torture, public executions, the recruitment of child soldiers, and many more that the Taliban explained as being part of the new and inclusive Islamic government. But this is nothing new. Rather, this is a return to the Taliban we saw 20 years ago in Afghanistan. Despite this long-winded list of basic human rights violations, we still see opposition. The opposition is nearly indistinguishable to the arguments made by the opposition we're hearing from today. The opposition itself has created an obligation to excuse the actions of the Taliban, as well as create an obligation to, as well as excuse their own complicity and the humanitarian violations committed against the citizens of Afghanistan. In the course of fulfilling this obligation, they have not only entirely abandoned the rule of law outlined in the responsibility to protect, as well as they've denied the people and abandoned the people of Afghanistan. However, similar to the opposition, continues to upholding their obligation to support the Taliban government and ultimately deny and abandon the people of Afghanistan for the tragedies they've been forced to endure. We, the government, find it to be our obligation and responsibility to lift and protect the voices of the Afghan people. And we are humbled and honored to do so. And our intent is to encourage everyone listening this evening to do the same. In fulfilling this obligation, the government stands in firm affirmation of the resolution. But first and foremost, we stand with the people of Afghanistan. Flashing back to 2001, after learning the terrorist organization of Al-Qaeda was being provided sanctuary by the Taliban ally, the US of course demanded the Taliban turn over Osama bin Laden. The Taliban refused to turn its back on their brother in arms, and the US invaded, temporarily eradicated Al-Qaeda and their leader, and toppled the Taliban government. After this, with US guidance, a constitution of Afghanistan was officially established in 2004, replacing the old temporary transnational government. This constitution allowed for the first election of an Afghan president. Despite intimidation and threats from the Taliban, the Afghan people went, and the turnout was incredible. 55% of the people voted for the current president, well, the previous president, Hamid Karzai. This constitution focused on ensuring equality, national unity, and instilling democratic values with a specific focus on human rights, similar to our very own constitution. With the force of the United States military behind the new government, the Taliban were unable to make good on their threats and were forced into hiding for 20 years. Fatima Galani, the female face of Afghan resistance, speaks of this time fondly. Still, when I'm tired, I go back, she says. I close my eyes and go back to that time. Even the smell of Kabul was different. I remember myself and my friends feeling spirited and hopeful for our future. Unfortunately, this hope has now been replaced with pain and sorrow for herself and the people of Afghanistan. With the reemergence of the Taliban and the toppling of the former government, these instrumental changes, endowed by their constitution, no longer exist. They instead have been replaced with the iron fist and guns of the Taliban. Since coming into power, the Taliban have reasserted their power by hanging people in Harats, public shaming. Girls have been taken out of schools completely. Female professors are no longer allowed to teach. Women have been barred from working completely. There have been public executions, and bodies have been left in the streets for citizens to find as a warning. We knew the situation going into Afghanistan was going to be bad and would only get worse before it got better. That's why we stayed after we killed the leader of Al-Qaeda. We had the knowledge that failed states such as Afghanistan would only continue to be a breeding place for extremists and terrorists, not to mention that we could not allow for the abuses of Afghanistan citizens to continue. So we stayed in order to help Afghanistan create a stable nation with a strong central government. And for a time, we were able to successfully do so. However, we did fall short. And for the success of this counterinsurgency, the main factor for losing was the citizens. The success of any counterinsurgency is determined by the support that it gains from its own citizens in that territory. This support did not exist due to the lack of action following the inauguration of former President Karzai. The government of Kabul lacked proper institutions to support the people. There was truly no institutional support from the government. Instead, it let the US military, who was building schools and attempting to work with the locals, rather than the people who really wanted the effort from the Afghan government itself, the people they elected. There was no separation of duties. The US military was also supplying a large amount of humanitarian aid to the Afghan people. While being a wonderful gesture, it's not the job of the US military to supply humanitarian aid. Again, the people would rather it be the people who are supposed to protect them. And again, that's who they elected. That's who the government chose. That's who the people chose. While they very much enjoyed their new freedoms and possibilities that were earned by the Constitution that they drafted, with their blood, sweat, and tears, they yearned for a strong central government to support them. The citizens of Afghanistan have not yet felt the benefits of a fully functioning government, and with the Taliban, they never will. I will end my plea with you with a plea from the Afghan people, from their own constitution. This is to establish an order based on the people's will and democracy, form a civil society void of oppression, atrocity, discrimination, as well as violence, based on rule of law, social justice, protecting integrity and human rights, and attaining people's freedoms and fundamental rights. Strengthen political, social, economic, as well as defense institutions. Attain a prosperous life and sound living environment for all inhabitants of this land. And eventually, regain Afghanistan's appropriate place in the international community. Thank you.
All right, Ben, if you'll please stand to the podium.
Hello everyone. Sorry, I gotta take off my mask. Perfect. My name is Ben Kimchi. Along with my partner here, Isaac, I stand with the opposition. We ask, how could continuing an unwinnable war be just? In this speech, let's look at the cost of the war. Let's consider the past and let's look towards the future. And let's try to understand how this question can be answered. So first, let's start with the cost. The cost justified withdrawal. 7,300 days. For 7,300 days, America fought in Afghanistan. What did it cost? Each day, we spent $300 million. Each day, innocent people died. Each day, families were ripped apart. 7,300 days. How could anyone want even one more? The cost justified withdrawal. But even if we were to ignore the past, the cost of the past, you should still fill out your ballot for opposition as we provide for a better future. And the reason, like most good reasons, starts with drugs. What do I mean? Opium. The growth of poppy plants and the production of opium and heroin fuels the Taliban. In fact, the majority of the funding for the Taliban comes from the production of opium. In the early 2000s, the Afghan government banned the cultivation of poppy plants, and following this, the Taliban nearly collapsed. However, as my partner Isaac brought up, the involvement of the United States military in Afghanistan fractured the police force of Afghanistan. It made it impossible for them to enforce laws. That same report found that America had been ignoring the problem at hand. And in 2009, the US Senate Committee on Foreign Relations found that the only way that the Taliban could be defeated was to sever its connection with opium. The failure of the war in Afghanistan, both in ignoring the opium trade and our military nullifying the Afghan police, allowed for a resurgence of the Taliban, where their numbers and power grew immensely. Now keep in mind, both sides today agree that in a lot of respects, the war was a failure, and that the problem is the Taliban. But consider which side creates a better world for the Taliban, creates a better opportunity to solve for them. The United States withdrawal from the Taliban, they've lost the support of opium farmers, and international and economic pressure has forced the Taliban to distance themselves from the market. So what works to stop the Taliban? Increasing local Afghan police, that works. Cutting off the Taliban from opium money, that works. Increasing population-based action, that works. Withdrawal was the end to, quote, a state of exception in which the United States has broken international law and violated human rights through extraordinary measures, end quote. Through torture, drone strikes, and attacks that indiscriminately killed Afghan people, the United States' involvement in Afghanistan was a gross injustice. And when we ask the questions, was it justified to end the war? Consider the 50,000 innocent civilians who died as a result of the war. Consider the cost of the war. The past tells us that continuing this war, that was unjust. The US military does not work. We know this empirically. Our military's involvement in Afghanistan is counterproductive in the fight against terrorism. It is counterproductive in creating a stable Afghanistan. Continuing the war would have continued adding fuel to the burning fire of the Taliban. Every civilian killed by the war fueled popular support for the Taliban, a fact that the CIA themselves have realized. The only solution was to cut off the root of the problem, end the popular support that came from the continuance of the war, and the financial support that came from the opium market. This is how you stop the Taliban. You solve the problem at its roots. If you've ever tried trimming weeds, you know that that doesn't work to get rid of the weeds. You have to uproot the problem from the source. And in opposition, we find that the government continuing the war, that was not removing the source of the problem. Prolonging the war would have worsened the lives of Afghan civilians on the whole. 20 years and 20 years have shown that the war was not going to work. Now, the government side may want you to believe that there was some change, that the war somehow was going to change, and that benefits were going to come. But the reality of the situation was that for 20 years we know that this wasn't the case. The US showed no sign of this happening, so as long as today's debate is grounded in the real world, continuing the war was only going to exacerbate the problems of the Afghan people, increase violence against women as it had for the past 20 years, hurt the rights of man. And the government side told us all something very important today, something that we should keep in mind when we are deciding how we vote for this round. With guns, you can kill terrorists. With education, you can kill terrorism. Continuing the war was continuing to use guns to fight a problem that guns could not solve. Vote for the side that solves for the root of the problem, not the side that would continue adding more guns to a problem that was not solved by guns. Additionally, the government side says that democracy was working while we were there. They bring up Karzai. Karzai was a corrupt power broker who was ruthless. They mention an election where the people voted popularly, but they failed to mention the other 4 elections where the popular candidate wasn't selected because of corruption in Afghanistan. The Afghan government, as long as the United States was there, was corrupt. We both agree in this round that war is failure. And we both agree that guns did not solve the problem. So why would we continue adding guns to the problem? We had to solve the problem at its root. To solve the Taliban, to solve terrorism, you cut off the popular support that came from the war, that came from the death of innocent civilians. Because when you ask whether or not our withdrawal was justified, consider the 50,000 lives that were lost because of the war. And ask yourselves the question, how could it be justice to continue an unwinnable, never-ending war? Thank you.
With that, the second round of questioning will begin. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I will recognize you.
This time for Ben. You seem to talk a lot about the state of affairs in 2000, and you make a very convincing argument about exactly how our military entry into Afghanistan kind of made things worse after that. But I was just wondering, with withdrawal, is there really any guarantee that our presence not being there will necessarily make things better?
So there's no guarantee, and that's the reality of the situation. And that's why it's so important to consider the cost of the past, because that is guaranteed. While any hypothetical situation in the future, we don't know for sure. But in reality, we can look at the past and say that what was going on would have continued. That's the reasonable way to look at the future. But where I was going with the past point, because the cost of the past, because those are concrete, because we know what they cost, we can decide whether or not withdrawal was justified. We know it wasn't. We know it was because the war wasn't. The war cost 50,000 lives of innocent Afghan people. It hurt Afghanistan.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is a question for Ben, of course. Ben, in your speech, you mentioned that, and also Isaac, you reiterated the fact that we have spent so much money on this 2-decade-long failed initiative. But I would ask the House to consider the costs of all of the refugees that are currently coming into the United States and our allies. Just in Colombia, we're going to receive a massive influx of Afghan refugees, and these aren't going to be temporary residents. They're going to need our help to continue to sustain their livelihood here. They're going to need to be set up with jobs, with driver's license, with phones, etc. And so if we look at the long-term maintenance of something like that, how is that justifying withdrawing if we have all of these additional costs that are going to be happening? I would also like to add, Ben, you mentioned the quote that we have worsened the lives of Afghan civilians on a whole. Again, I would like to ask those of you present, I'm sure you have seen the pictures in media as of late of Afghan families in utter desperation giving up their newborn children to American soldiers in a hope that they will have a better life than they can, because they know from their past generations what will happen to them now that we are gone, and what the Taliban will do and has done and will continue to do. I'm sure you have seen the pictures and heard the stories of those who have climbed onto the evacuee planes in utter desperation yet again, of the famous Afghan football here is soccer, player who passed away from falling off of one of these planes. And so if we look at that, if these civilians that you talk about are in such a desperate and hysterical state to leave the country, how can we justify saying that they were worse off when we were there and that their lives will be better when we are gone?
So that's a great question. The real question here is, why was that the case? 2 decades of war, that's what created the problem. It wasn't the withdrawal. It was mismanagement. It was a war that had no end and caused constant uprooting of people. And so when you want to look towards what will work in the future, well, the first thing is you cut off the support for the Taliban. You cut off the support, you cut off the popular support, and you cut off the economic support. And when it comes to the refugee crisis, because of the United States withdrawing its forces, it now focuses on soft power. It holds the economic power of Afghanistan, of the Taliban, in exchange for ensuring that there is a peaceful departure for these people. And what we have seen is that last Saturday, the Taliban are now asking the United States to come to the table. They are the ones who want the negotiation to happen, and it's because the United States has cut off the root of their power. So when you look at things that can work for the future, you have to look at what has worked in the past. And we know that military efforts didn't work for Afghanistan, and we know that the reason that there's all these people who have lost their lives, who have been damaged by this situation in Afghanistan, it has been the result of a war, not the result of the withdrawal. Thanks.
So I have a question for Ben. You agreed with us that education is the most important part, and yeah. So as far as women go, you guys have kind of completely not talked about them at all. What do you think as far as education for women going forward?
So first, I'd say that, alongside protecting which side results in the protection of the most lives, that's really the important question. But as far as women, if you recall from Brown University, the war actually exacerbated their conditions. It made violence towards women far more likely. It made the rights of women worse. So a wartime Afghanistan was far worse, and when we look at the source of the problem, we have to understand that it's not the Afghanistan people, it's the Taliban, right? A poll of the Taliban people in 2021 found that, quote, an overwhelming majority supported protecting the rights of women. So it's really a small majority, the Taliban, that is threatening them. So to that extent, when we're looking at women, the question is, how do we solve for the Taliban? And let me ask, was the United States military solving for the Taliban? The answer is clear, it wasn't. 20 years show that it wasn't. So what will work? Well, education will work. Investing in Afghanistan's people, that will work. The military, guns, murder, that does not work.
So I'm glad that you said that. You said that military, guns, violence doesn't work. So as far as the new Taliban, as far as their new government institution goes, they've been slaughtering people in the streets, they've kept women inside, and they've also made a really big point of rounding up everyone who ever actually helped the United States and slaughtering them. So based on their standpoint of violence, how are they more beneficial than us occupying the area?
So again, the instability in Afghanistan was caused by the United States war there. So the problem is the war, not the withdrawal. That's important to keep in mind. But second, when we're looking at the long term, we know that the military efforts didn't solve for the Taliban. And even before the withdrawal, we know that the majority of Afghanistan was controlled by the Taliban. So you're asking yourself, what could possibly solve this? We already know what doesn't work, and that's the side that you support. You support the United States staying in Afghanistan with a military presence. We support trying alternative methods that actually might help the Afghan people.
So after we left, we assumed.
The chair will now carefully upon a question from the audience. Let's go with you in the back, the woman with the glasses. Laura, that's you.
Oh, that's me. Hi. This is a question for the opposition. You all can rock, paper, scissors, anyone wants to take it. But I guess my question is, our resolution doesn't talk about a withdrawal from Afghanistan, it talks about the withdrawal down to the one at the end of August 2021. So my question simply is, why now? You've given a convincing case of why a withdrawal is justified, but why the one from August 2021, why was that specifically justified?
So that's a really good question. And the important thing to look at here is that in the modern day, there was no perfect withdrawal. In fact, the only good withdrawal would have been a decade ago. It might have been more. And that's something that the government would agree with. They say that we took too long to withdraw. But today, because there was no good way to exit, any exit was the correct option. Because it was just to stop the war, to stop the death of innocent civilians. Really, it was a question of how was politically practical. And the way that we saw was politically practical. We know that because it happened. So if we're in a hypothetical question of could there have been a better withdrawal, the answer is sure. But if the question is, was the withdrawal justified, we know that the death of 50,000 innocent people, that justified it.
All right, students, you have a lot of questions. We have room for one more. You sir right there.
Okay, so my question is for Ben. So just something that you and Isaac have touched on a lot is the fact that I think you guys are making the case that a more justified response would have been to kind of take a more ground-up approach from a local level. How is that supposed to happen with a not only military withdrawal, but not a political withdrawal where there's no way for these people to resist a new government set in place by the Taliban that, as the government side has stated, is willing to use oppression, abuse, and outright execution?
So, also, very good point. The reason that this is so important to consider is that we know what the United States was doing was not this. And that's the reason we bring this up. They were trying to solve this from the top down. And we know that didn't work. And specifically, we know it kept local Afghan people from actually gaining the traction to have their own popular support. And so the important response here is that since the Taliban since the United States has withdrawn, the Taliban, their support has plummeted. It's down to 10%. And in a country of 40 million, there is now protest in the street where there's never been before. There's actually popular support and on-the-ground movement against the Taliban. That was not being solved by the United States going in, sending in drone strikes, killing civilians. None of that was helping. None of the top-down approaches were working, and we know that. We know that because 20 years has been a failure. And continuing it would not have solved for what we now have a problem with, which is that the people of Afghanistan didn't have a voice. And we know it was failing, and so it's more of a question of what was the correct choice for the future of Afghanistan. Withdrawing, unfortunately, was the right option.
All right. We ask those of you who have your questions to hold on to them for just 6 more minutes because now we are going to go to your bubble. So, starting with the government. Select one speaker to come up and refute the main ideas of the opposition in today's debate.
If we're all in order, I'll begin. So today's topic has been incredibly difficult for everyone to discuss. We are in an unfortunate situation where we have to address a nation that we left in shambles, and the opposition has agreed with us. We've also agreed on how to address it. The opposition and both the government have given multiple answers to what can be done to fix everything there. So this leads to the question of, if we know the answers and we know what we could have been doing and what we should have been doing, why didn't we do it and why did we leave? Leaving doesn't make sense, especially if the opposition is able to give you all of these answers that agree with ours. And as far as the opposition talked about it costs too much, I find it incredibly heinous to put a numerical value on the life of the people of Afghanistan. I believe that as far as money goes, and as far as the Right to Protection Act goes, that we completely undermined when we left. We are obligated to stay and help the Afghanistan people, especially considering we exacerbated a lot of the issues there, but not in the same way that the government is telling you we did. We exacerbated them by leaving. The government, well, the opposition told us multiple times that the Taliban are the issue. They're the ones doing all this. So why did we give them their power back to control everyone? They said that violence was the issue. We agree. The Taliban are enacting violence against everyone. Everyone who's ever helped us, and simply just everyone, all the citizens, because they can. Because there's no force like the United States to operate and stop them. They also talked about how we weren't able to establish a strong central government. However, for a period of time, we were. And the opposition agreed with us about that. We talked further about how there was President Karzai, and yes, there were issues about him being corrupt. He was the first ever elected president of Afghanistan. However, we also have our own corrupt politicians. To say otherwise is completely inaccurate, and if you're an American, you probably know that that's not true. Additionally, taking away the United States supports completely undermined everything that we intended to do. We took away their money, which was also what was being used to help with these humanitarian issues. We also talked about how we should be focusing more on the civil, how we should be interacting more with the civilians, and the opposition, well, the government also agreed with that. We talked about all these issues. We've been able to come together on both sides to narrow down all these issues and all these things that we could be doing to fix them. So this again leads to the question, why in the world would we leave? Especially if we can fix all these problems. We have the ability to do so. We just simply took our money away and we took our forces away. And we also quoted to you the acting chief of the military who stated that the withdrawal was unjust and simply didn't make sense. We've also seen history repeat itself. We left the Taliban. When the United States came into Afghanistan, we saw the Taliban disband. This is due to the fact that the United States was a threatening force to them. However, the minute we left, they came right back in. I don't see, and I don't think anyone who's truly looked at this logistically sees how us leaving the United States and allowing the Taliban to come back in and do everything that they just told you was bad solved anything, because it hasn't. Thank you.
Move to read the opposition. Give your vote.
All right, thank you. There comes the question of what did history teach us? Kyler comes up here and says history's repeating itself. We agree. The past 20 years show that history would repeat itself. Had we stayed in Afghanistan, we would have continued a conflict that cost lives. The question is, how do you solve? Well, today, Isaac and I are proud to say that ending the war, while not the solution to every problem, was the just course of action, because prolonging the war certainly did not solve. And there's this idea that Kyler has brought up, that the United States leaving showed that we were leaving all support. That's not true. Withdrawal meant withdrawal of military forces. It means that we are now transitioning to other means, soft power, that can work. And we know that the past 20 years have shown us that hard power doesn't work. So when the question is, should we have left and tried something else? The answer is obviously yes, because what we were doing was not working. We could have continued to bang our head against the wall, lose more lives, sacrifice more Americans, have more innocent people die in drone strikes, or we could withdraw and try something else. We could try funding Afghanistan from the bottom up. And what we've seen is that the Taliban has been cut off from popular support. They've lost their economic capacity. What we know is that withdrawing meant a change in action. Now, the United States and the world doesn't have to contribute to the problem. We can instead work towards a solution. Because the problem is that guns kill terrorists, but they don't kill terrorism. It breeds terrorism the longer we stay. And keep in mind that today's question is whether or not withdrawal was justified. It was. Because the solution to Afghanistan was not more guns. It was not more drone strikes. It was not more military efforts that ended up in the deaths of civilians, that fueled popular support. That's the question. We aren't withdrawing in terms of no more support. We're withdrawing in terms of the military. And that is beneficial because the military was not solving for the Taliban. They talk about issues created by the Taliban, but these issues were made worse as the Taliban was allowed to grow because of the United States military. The right time to leave was 10 years ago, but the next best was now. Had the United States not left, more innocent people would have died. They also say that Karzai was a little corrupt. That is the understatement of the year. The man was a ruthless killer. Of the 4 elections that they had, that was the only one that was even popular. The rest of them were decided based on whoever had more power. To suggest that they had democracy is absurd. The United States did not set up a stable government. They made it unstable in Afghanistan. They killed innocent civilians. They fueled terrorism. And because of that, Afghanistan is in shambles. The decision to change action, to try something new, that was the right decision. Thank you.
All right, now we are beginning our final Q&A session of the debate. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. All right.
My question is for the government. I don't really have a preference as to who answers it. The basic proposition on how we should not have withdrawn is basically that we should have stayed around until the Afghanistan government reached some unspecified level of democracy, but the underpinning of that is that the United States should have essentially free will to operate as an imperial power around the world. It's not unjust that the United States should be given that license as just one country to decide the internal politics and policies of individual nations.
So I do agree that it would be unjust if we were to go in there imperially and to take over and to completely disregard the wishes of the people of Afghanistan. However, that was not the case. We went in there, we took over the Taliban, and we toppled that government specifically because they were not wanted. Moving forward, we also helped establish a constitutional democracy, well, not constitutional, we helped establish a democracy republic. They helped to establish a constitution in which the will of the people were enforced. So I don't think that as far as leaving solved any of that. I think we toppled all the institutions that we could have helped maintain.
Looking for another question? Mr. Valenti?
I've got a two-parter for the government. I promise to make it quick, and whichever one of you wants to answer is fine by me. So, do you guys have empirics about the amount of violence before and after the U.S. withdrawal? On if there was more or less violence before and after we left?
May I request for elaboration? Are you referencing violence as a whole, or specifically violence towards women, or violence against those who oppose the Taliban?
I'll go with as a whole.
So as a whole, as far as Soviet Union, before we got there, there was definitely a decrease in violence. We saw that there was benefits for everyone. We talked more about that. We talked about how they established all of these benefits and how people were able to more freely participate. We saw more women in politics. This also saw a decrease in violence. There's been a study shown that the more women we have, education-wise, the better the society functions as a whole. So we saw a decrease in that violence as far as that. Additionally, when we went in, we also saw that decrease initially. We saw the Taliban exiting because they had that threatening force from us. Afterwards, when we left, the minute we announced our arrival, there was actual quote from the general who stated, it's going to be about 12 to 24 months before we actually see the Taliban reemerge. They came back within 24 hours and they immediately started to attack every single person who opposed them or ever helped the United States, and they started going out in the streets and harming more people. And well, we haven't heard from the women because they are locked away in their houses if they have not been beheaded in the street.
Okay, and the second part of my question, as you just acknowledged, when we left, the whole house of cards fell down. What should we have done if we stayed longer to have ensured that we could leave them with solid footing so that they wouldn't fall immediately upon our departure?
So what we talked about was the counterinsurgency methods. It's very important that we have the support of the citizens on our side. So that means that we need to be more boots on the ground and talking more with citizens. There was a 101 study in which there were more military presence and they were working more with citizens instead of actually driving around in the streets and their vehicles damaging them. And we saw that people were coming forward to talk with them and to give them information about where the Taliban were, and that they were more forward-coming and they were more comfortable with us in that part. We also need to focus more on making sure that civilians are actually part of it. That also goes along with having the Constitution. That was a really important time for Afghanistan. We talked about how people were happy, specifically how there was a woman who was actually able to be a part of this government because she was never able to do that before, despite the fact that her family prior to all this intervention was actually a part of the government. So we need to have more civilian presence. We need to have more acknowledgement of that.
I would like to add on to that. As the opposition mentioned, currently there is, I believe, less than 10% popular support for the Taliban. Is that correct?
Yes.
This is a beautiful statistic. At the same time, the fact that the United States left all of their equipment behind, just giving it to the Taliban, and pretty much, it doesn't matter how much popular support they have if they have the use of force. They will force people into submission. And so the issue of support, yes, the majority do not support the Taliban. They are scared out of their minds, and that is why we see the pictures that we see today in news articles of people in desperation trying to leave the country.
All right, looking for more questions. You, sir, all in the back.
This is directed towards the opposition. So, many of the soft power options, which you've referenced throughout the night as being alternatives to direct military action, have been internal, whether that be the creation of more effective local police forces or improvements in education. And I just wanted you to elaborate on how, assuming that the Taliban are not ousted by the people over whom they currently rule, how you plan or how you could see these internal measures being implemented when you have a Taliban-controlled government over Afghanistan.
So, I'm not entirely sure if I understand your question. Are you saying that since the Taliban is losing popularity, they're going to still be in power once we begin to institute some sort of soft power efforts?
No. I think what I'm saying is that many of your solutions rest on the idea that the Taliban will be removed by their own people. They're dependent upon it. I'm asking if you think things like strong local police forces or improved education can be effectively implemented if the Taliban remain in power despite their lack of popularity.
So while the long-term solution is internally, the way to get there is externally. The external solutions that we talked about just last Saturday, the Taliban are asking the United States to unfreeze their assets. Because that the United States has such economic control over the Taliban, we are able to implement these measures through soft power. Through sanctions, the United Nations has been effective in solving for the Taliban. The reality is that externally, there are solutions to solve for the Taliban. You cut off their supply, you cut off their source, you solve the problem.
All right, looking for any more questions?
All right, just a brief yes or no question, trying to probe something out from both sides. I'm going to start with the government. Again, just yes or no. Does withdrawal preclude any future involvement in Afghanistan?
Somebody say something.
I was thinking about it. I'm sorry, could you re-ask your question?
Yeah, does withdrawal preclude any future involvement in Afghanistan, I suppose specifically in domestic politics in Afghanistan?
I would say so.
Okay. The same question to the opposition.
Absolutely not.
Okay, thank you. That makes so much more sense. Thank you.
All right, we're about to run out of time. Any last minute questions?
Hi, sorry, girl with the tall bun again. So this is kind of for both sides, that obviously all of us here are pretty well educated people, otherwise we wouldn't come out to a debate on a Thursday. But just say for a second that we're not. Explain your side just like briefly to a layperson, someone who has no idea what's gone on in Afghanistan. Just like give us that quick summary. Government first and opposition.
So are you asking like the entire history of it, or just like
Just
right
give us
now?
a summary of your case.
Okay, so right now we are arguing that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was unjust due to the fact that we have completely left the people of Afghanistan defenseless. We have reinstalled the Taliban. They have been able to effectively target every single person who was ever helping us. They've also been able to revert back to the traditional ways in which the Afghan people originally righted against. So again, we're seeing that pattern of where we make the same mistakes and we just keep doing it and we hope for better. As the opposition said, we hope things turn out well, or sometimes things just solve themselves, and I don't think that's the case with a nation who was just completely uprooted with our help.
Okay, cool.
I would like to add on to that, if you don't mind. You were asking if, let's say, a typical Mizzou student who isn't well versed in this topic, I would, after she would give that good historical example and just kind of go into those terminologies, I would look at it from a local perspective. If we look at Columbia, Missouri, I have acquaintances that are students at Mizzou that are from Afghanistan. And I talked to one of them, and the first week of school, he has just finished his master's degree and was planning to go back to Afghanistan to be with his family the very next day. But because of the situation, because of the United States' actions in Afghanistan, he was unable to go and visit his family. And so, in the true spirit of an Afghan citizen, he said, you know what, I will stay here, I will do my PhD. And I think that in itself proves the spirit of these people. And the media will only try to show you the 10% support that does support the Taliban, but these are people that need our help so that they can get back to their families, so they can use the knowledge and education, like we mentioned, education is the key to fighting terrorism. These people that are educating themselves on campus here in Columbia need to bring that education and those resources back to their home country so that proper, from the ground up, we can establish democracy in Afghanistan.
So the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again while expecting a different result. The opposition side supports trying something different. We say that an unwinnable war, a failure of a war, should have been ended so that we can actually try a solution that might work in Afghanistan. The opposition says, look towards the history. Let's stop making the same mistakes. Let's learn from the past and not repeat the errors. The opposition says it's time for change.
And to add on to that, I'd like to bring up an analogy for the judges to think about when they decide on this round. If you build a car that's destined to explode when it runs out of gas, you can't get mad at the car when it runs out of gas. You built the car. So when the United States chooses to leave Afghanistan, it's not because we are unjust people. We don't want to see the implications of what would happen if we continued this never-ending war.
All right. With that in mind, our question and answer session is now officially over. But before we, decide who the winners are, we have to do one last poll of the audience. See who has their mind changed or different positions in swayed at all. So, once again, raise your hand if you believe that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was unjustified. All right. Now raise your hand if you believe you're unsure about whether or not the withdrawal from Afghanistan was justified at all. You have no strong feelings about it. You're not sure whether or not the withdrawal was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. Ooh, that's good. Now raise your hand if you believe that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was the right choice to make. Oh, sorry. Keep them up. All right. Oh! All right. Thank you. All right. So with that in mind, we're going to give our judges just a little bit of time to fill out their ballots. We're going to tabulate those ballots. We're going to see the results of our poll. So in the meantime, Bingle, just hang out for a little bit. We will get you the result of this tournament very shortly. Thank you all for coming out.
See you. That was so useful because
You want to record all the
They counted our votes.
Here, all the different parts, just focus on what that little part says.
like a time. That's what I needed.
Number. Oh, actually, my bad. That's not right. Half of the points, and you're at the highest point. But you guys, let's get all so much coming out.
What's so many things? I know, no, legitimately, I was like, I do not know what is going on. Everyone keeps saying things, and you say the same things, and I'm confused. I want to debate, not a slide and read. What's going on? So, yes, I'm still not sure. I like raising my hand. I was like, I need to choose a side. I don't even know what to do. No, it's just like that, and I was like, I picked a side. It was frustrating. I was upset.
Yeah, I said that, and I was like, thank you. I've never been to one of it. I don't know what's going on. So I'm sitting here and I'm like, what? And then they're like, why are you guys talking about the same thing?
I saw you and I was like,
I was like, I can't tell you what to do on I got way too loud. I'm so sorry. And then we'll do. It's a worthwhile program. Everyone knows. Caleb, can you just keep it on one screen for a second?
That's good. No, never mind.
Oh, that's fine.
That works? Okay, that's
We like hugging each other.
Oh, yeah.
How we doing over here? Everything? Alright, I'm gonna come back in about like a minute. I'll slow down enough once. Yes, please, that'd be awesome.
It's not an Indian question. Okay, are you talking about the like religious or oh, there's more than
I have to catch my bus, and I have to make dinner before the party. I have to be at the house. My bus leaves at 8:30. We're on like staggered buses. It's like, really? Okay, that would be great. I will take that. Beautiful. Where do you live? Right. Oh, I just have to. Oh, can I just like thank God or not? Absolutely. I'm currently fighting to do parking on that. So yeah, I need to go back there on Monday. It's busy Monday. Wednesday. Busy Wednesday. Next 2 Mondays from now. That's when I'm free.
Such a good mom.
Except after you're president of the United States, you can't actually drive your own car. Yeah, the Secret Service drives you around. I think you still can. So you do, unless you refuse it. Like Carter still has his. Oh, Kevin? Yeah, no, I'm not gonna need Kevin.
I'm glad I didn't see you.
For you, yes. For me, I'm gonna, like, you can always drive on your own. Probably something different than drive. I have cars. So I can drive. I would find that unethical. I would buy a car.
We're just talking to you should perhaps consider it. You are here.
I don't know. Yeah, I feel like it's a lot. The only thing that comes to mind is great. That's great. I haven't even watched this season. I'm slowly getting through it. It's tough. That's what I've heard. Yeah. So I've watched a couple of episodes, and then it's good. Like I didn't want like 5 Emmys. So I'm like, it's a lot of I thought you were talking about like this is such an United States, and I was like, what? No. Yeah, I was like, what is going on? I was like, what information do you know that I do not? About the secession of the United States.
I mean, yeah, pretty good.
And I stand by that. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I still have stuff to do tonight. I might just not go to the divorce party. It doesn't sound that fun. Barcodes. Well, it's technically the sky bar. I don't know. I would rather just hang out at Riley's. It's delightful. I would rather do that, but then I'd have to do this for another party. Oh no, I don't really know any of the frat guys. I didn't hang out around that. I might just not go. LOL. I think I signed up and I will not. I'm not 21, so I can't do anything. So I would just be standing sober around I work tomorrow at 8. Yeah, it sounds like I'm not going to my divorce party. I also we don't have one. It's okay. We never had a marriage party. Like actually, had a divorce party. Since like one of our frads was on probation and they worked really hard to get us some divorce party. Also, like I don't know any of these frat guys. And I don't want to talk about marriage. So yeah. After physically running into them, that was not fun. I was at Scapa and I was like, this is my house. Alright.
No problem. Don't forget to circle which team you think won, like that little top section. Also, if either if any of you want to like judge again in the future, just let me know. I'll make sure to reach out to you. I was hoping you to. Good job.
I'm totally 6'5" with them on Sunday. Yeah, I really like my stories this time around.
I'm the biggest one. I love that. Thank you.
First time I did not.
You know,
So let's go. And hopefully, yes.
This was fun. I'm glad you liked it. We loved it.
I've seen his name in the group chat. I don't know her directly. Okay. Yikes. Is she senior? Yeah, then I know what she
just by your hair. Just by your hair.
I don't know if I get it. Ashley, Weir, and Blake, Caleb Cloud. And Madeline. Oh, it's her face. She's junior. Okay. Sorry, I like that. No, you're good. We were the same age when she got me.
The issue is that they didn't lean enough into the kind of counter-argument. Why is it our job to punch them? They both would have done a much better job if they would have just seen their arguments and
Yeah, I knocked it a little. There were too many bigs for littles, and I got a call home player and she's like, hey, you're a little wrong. I thought you were. I was like, that's the girls I had that like with. They were gonna, and she was like, you want? I was like, no. I'm sorry, no. Oh, so I have the most you want them? You don't have in-laws? Oh, you do. Mine's not that complicated. We have Jaden, a senior, her little so it like skips a little bit, but then Riley is my big. Jesse in between them dropped, so it's just like Wade and Riley, and then I'm the same age as Riley, but she took Sierra at the same time, so me and Sierra are twins, and then Sierra has a little sister, and then in the spring if I take a little or two, then we'll get those, and it's like pretty good, we just got a little gap, but it does go senior, junior, sophomore, freshman, which is nice, and then I'm over here, I'm like, It's just sitting in my closet. It's like I have like 16 canvases. I have 3 baskets. I have 2 bags full of shirts. I think next fall I might. If I don't find it, I have enough here. You have to have so much shit, and the fact that I have enough for it, plus I have this discount. I bought a bundle. There was a girl who bought it, who's selling it like May, and I got like weird stuff for like $60. It's not that bad considering it's like $100 for dessert. So I think it's like Run didn't have anything that could for me. And I was
much more complicated than having 3,000 boots in a can.
But I'll just
Another thing that the government kept going back to, they keep talking about technology, but really what that stuff is more of a financial thing. Around the edges of again, rural areas where
it's just like those long hairs
as opposed to in the cities where there's
humiliating. I'm like,
as liberal as Afghanistan.
like, don't complain.
It's very weird. Putting
Yeah, no, she was like, this is humiliating in all caps, and I was like, okay, I came to fix this.
it just doesn't work at all. It's really interesting. I don't think we should leave
Kind of, but I just tell you one so like, if it comes to that, I will. I'm there and I can't I'm gonna make some tacos tonight.
What? That's hilarious. That's ridiculous.
This is where it's gonna go.
Right, yeah, it's like right here. I appreciate that y'all showed solidarity and not raising our hand
And my
final
registration
call.
date is the
That was very
validating. And Rebecca was like, I will be doing that. Rebecca's so cute.
I don't know if I'll get it.
Like 10 a.m. Monday through Friday. So Rebecca, raise your hand. I will.
I said you're very
I was like this.
beginning, I think
Do you have Rebecca? Yeah. We do. I like it. I think Rebecca's two of my majors. And I see Thomas from I love Rebecca so much.
First and foremost, let me apologize for how long this took. We're going to find new ways to have the balance in the future. I promise you this will be more efficient. But I'm very proud to announce that the winners of this debate is the opposition team. They both will be taking home the prize given to the winning team at $300 per person. So congratulations, guys. And the winner of the best speaker in today's debate is Ben Kimchi. So congratulations. This has been a spectacular debate. As somebody who founded this organization 3 years ago as a freshman in college who had no idea COVID was coming and who was disheartened at all the work it took, it just fills me with so much joy to see this room filled with people, brimming with curiosity. It is exactly what I envisioned this would be. I hope it would be. So thank you so much for coming out. But I'm not going to end it there. We are going to have another debate in the future, this next semester. If you want to do it, let me know. I'll add you to the Mizzou the Missouri Debate Union group chat, and you can stay in touch. It's going to be very similar. We're going to start working on it right now. So if you want to either participate or just help work on it, let me know. And also, we have another event coming up, two specifically. We're going to collaborate with ASUM in the near future to create a different kind of debate, but one that's focused on the issues that directly affect students here on campus. If you're interested in that, feel free to reach out to Matthew there and or myself and ask any questions. And with that, we also have one last event. We will, in the near future, either by the end of this month or in the next December or start of January, we will have Scott Sifton, one of the front runners for the Democratic nomination to run for the Senate in Missouri. He will come talk to the MDU. We'll do an interview-style session, and we hope that'll be, and we know it'll be very informative. So once again, thank you all for coming out. Have a good night, and take care. Thank you.